네, 이번 2021 한국포럼은 제로웨이스트 포럼으로 진행이 되고 있습니다. 최근 일상생활에서 많은 분들이 쓰레기 줄이기, 재활용하기 운동에 적극적으로 참여를 하고 계신데요. 오늘날 이런 대중적인 참여와 또 실천이 있기까지 목소리를 내주신 분들이 있습니다. 그분들 중 힙합 래퍼이자 또 청년 환경운동가인 시우테즈칼 마르티네즈의 강연과 질의응답 함께 보시겠습니다.
Piali, Timoetase, how's it going? Saludos a todos. Greetings, y'all. My name is Siutetzcal. Nochanon poem boler colorado al tepetl. Morincal pulicuela ma al tepetl. I'm Mexica. My people are the Mexica peoples, the indigenous peoples of Mexico Tenochtitlan. I'm an organizer, an artist, and the journey in the climate and environmental justice space began at a very young age. My pops is from Mexico. I was raised very traditionally. You know, our ceremonial ways, those teachings, those indigenous teachings were very close to our whole upbringing as children. And a lot of that came with this awareness that our relationship to land, our relationship to community, our relationship to our culture was grounded in a symbiotic relationship between ourselves and the natural world. These concepts that as people, we oftentimes separate ourselves from the natural world, from the world around us. And I grew up very differently, you know, understanding and learning and thinking that the land around us is an extension of who we are. And for indigenous peoples, a lot of our ceremonies, a lot of our teachings, a lot of our ways are grounded in our relationship to our relatives, our kin around us, our plant relatives, our animal relatives, you know, our relationship with water, you know, seeing it as a sacred living being. That was all very significant in shaping how I saw these issues. My mom's side, my mom was an environmentalist and an educator and worked to start a school called the Earth Guardian School in 1992 in Maui, Hawaii. And all around me growing up, we were going to protests and we were learning about environmental issues. And I think on my father's side, that relational connection to the world around us in combination with my mom's history and work as an organizer, working with young people, working to build, you know, platforms and spaces to uplift the voices of young people. Those two came together to inform my upbringing and who I was as a child. And getting involved in climate and environmental justice spaces came from, you know, that world, that way of being raised, being at the protests since I was a little kid, seeing other people speaking out about it. My older siblings were also, like, as I was growing up, they were performing and using music, using hip hop, using their voices, speaking and presenting at schools, organizing protests in the community in Colorado where I grew up, to help, you know, tell new stories. And I think a lot of where we are right now in the world is a result of the stories that we have chosen to live by. And what I mean by that is, even if we look at the climate movement and the way that many people view environmental justice work or climate work or activism, is from this certain story that we have been told that is upheld through media, through other climate and environmental activists who kind of contribute to this narrative, to a long history of environmentalism being kind of this cause that is outside of our humanity. In the United States, we have seen it as a very white space for a very long time that isn't inclusive of and doesn't explicitly work to uplift and empower the voices of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. And so as a child, you know, being involved in the climate and environmental space, I started to learn the stories that were told around how we engaged with the crisis, the climate crisis, and how we engage with the solutions. When I started watching documentaries about the climate crisis, when I started listening to the voices that were speaking, it was a lot of the same story about a future apocalypse, about a catastrophic world where weather events were going to destroy our chances of passing this world on to future generations. It was a lot of doom and gloom. It was a lot of scientists, older white scientists predominantly, speaking at the public, telling us to be afraid, to be concerned, to be worried, to be aware, to change our lifestyle habits, to consume less plastic, to, do the simple things to reduce our personal carbon footprint, all these different things. And as I got older, we began to challenge those narratives and step into our power to voice new stories, right? And so what we see when we look at the world and at the climate crisis is not simply an energy issue. When I look at the climate crisis, it is a manifestation of the imbalance of our relationship to the world around us. The climate crisis is a continuation of the violent mindset that has existed between people and the land since the colonization of these continents in North and South America. It's a continuation of this idea of consumption and exploitation of the people of the land, of the genocide of the indigenous peoples of these places, the enslavement of our African relatives that were brought over to work this land to create and grow profit for the wealthy few, for the white owning class. And those are not just historical issues that has laid the foundation of the United States, of our governance, of our economy, of our relationship to one another, of our relationship to land. And so I think the climate crisis, yes, it is weather events. Yes, it is an energy crisis. Yes, it is the overconsumption and absurd amount of burning of fossil fuels to fuel these consumptive lifestyles and to profit, these rich corporations. But I think that within all that, the climate crisis is also a symptom of colonialism and these unjust ways of relating to the earth that were taught to us. Those were the stories that were written that showed us how to engage with the land. And not always just individually, but we look at our governments and the ways that our governments are structured. They don't always exist. And what I've seen a lot in my life and in my work in the United States, that the government doesn't exist to protect our communities and our people. I spent a lot of my time organizing in Colorado around the issue of fracking, of hydraulic fracturing, of natural gas extraction. And we saw, elected officials that ran for their positions of power, talking about the climate crisis and talking about, environmental policy and things that sounded good. And then when they got into power, they were selling out our communities for the expansion of this industry, of this oil and gas industry. They were threatening the health and well-being of community members across the Front Range of Colorado. Their health, their well-being, their safety to continue to expand because of how much money there is in politics, because the same oil and gas companies that are expanding across Colorado, across the communities that I grew up in, are giving massive campaign contributions to the politicians that are in office, that are shaping policy, Democrat, Republican, regardless of party lines, right? I saw as a child so much political corruption in my hometown and in these local elections. And so, we come to think it's not simply because these are evil people or bad people. It's because the system is taught us that the exploitation of land and the exploitation of communities is what leads us to progress. And it's our communities and our people aren't simply in the way, and looking at the larger picture of the climate crisis too, it's not some abstract future that is far away. The climate crisis is creating mass suffering in the world right now. We have the resources we need to feed the world. to create access to good jobs, to clean drinking water, to healthcare for all. We have access to these resources. And rather than to pursue a prosperous future, the stories that have been told that uphold these violent systems of white supremacy, of patriarchy, of settler colonialism, put us in a position where our relationship continues systemically, societally, to be one of extraction, exploitation, violence, the destruction of land, and the dispossession of land from indigenous peoples and from communities. So for me, the journey of understanding the climate crisis has been a journey of understanding humanity and the elements that have contributed to our distancing from our own humanity, you know. And so I did a lot of work locally in Colorado as an organizer, as an activist, spoken at the United Nations, at several different places and platforms that I'm privileged to share my voice. And what I realized too is that, you know, these institutions and these spaces that, like the United Nations, like these different places, like for me, that's not where I felt the most empowered. And I've been doing this for a long time. And I've been bringing my message and these stories to a lot of different places. And I was going to the United Nations and seeing some of the most important conversations of our lifetime being met with like empty eyes, like the representatives of many of these nations, and you know, there's just a level of passiveness that I saw in these spaces that was mind blowing. The climate crisis is the defining issue of our generation, of our time. It connects every other issue, from access to clean water, to education, to the policing of our communities and the violence against our Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters, relatives. It connects all these issues. It is something that will continue to exploit those that are the most exploited in our world and on our communities and our countries. The poorest of us, the blackest of us, the darkest skinned of us, those that have been historically marginalized the most. And where I saw fire and where I saw passion and excitement, where I saw the will of the people to transform and grow and move these conversations, wasn't in spaces like the United Nations. And I found that in the streets, and I found that in community, and I found that in moments where we were able to look at the climate crisis, not just as an energy issue, as a policy issue, as a bureaucratic, you know, motion to check off different boxes on a list of things to do. But it was grounded in love, in a love for our land, and a love for our community, and a love for our culture, and a love for our futures, for indigenous futures, for Black futures, for intersectional futures, for the futures of those who have not only built the country that I live in, but the futures of those who have undergone the most and done the most rigorous work to defend the land. Indigenous people make up a small percentage of the world's population, I think a little less than 5%, but protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. Indigenous people are at the forefront of battling the climate crisis. Indigenous stewardship over land is a critical element of addressing the climate crisis. And to advance that project and that agenda, I've done a lot of work with different institutions or organizations, but I think for me, what I found is one of the most potent and powerful ways to express this is through art. It's through music. It's through hip hop. Rap music, hip hop music is this vibrant, incredibly complex and beautiful language and culture that is deeper than just a musical genre that came into my life when I was young and showed me how we can speak about revolution through this beautiful language. In my language, the language of my people, Nahuatl, we have a word that's Xochitl, which is like poetry, which is like, it's hard to translate and explain it to English, but when I listen to rap music, like I had a feeling that connected me to it. It was just like, I don't know, different, right? And so I started to listen to and study hip hop, and I started to sit with different OGs in our community that were a part of the culture as DJs, as breakdancers, as MCs, as poets, as graffiti artists, and learn about the culture. And as I continued to be more and more passionate about that, more and more aware of how the world around us was changing, about how capitalism was continuing to exploit our communities and destroy our planet and build pipelines on indigenous land and strip our lands of its resources and put the weight of this on our backs, of our people's backs. You know, hip hop became the outlet to tell these stories and to express this and to connect to community. And I started touring, I started making music. Like the last several years, especially, music has entered my life as a very cathartic mechanism for me to understand my own relationship to my voice, to my leadership, and express and share that with the world. Right before the pandemic, right before quarantine hit heavy in the United States, I played an album release show with an artist from LA, my brother named True, and we were releasing our project, Voice Runners, and the energy in that room, the energy at that show mirrored the fire that I experienced in the streets, marching with the youth, with the people, you know, at the global climate strikes here in New York, like when there was hundreds of thousands of youth out in the streets fighting for climate justice, using our voices. Like that's the energy that we felt in that venue, in that concert hall. We were moshing, you know, we were giving it all of our energy, all of our attention, all of our love, and communicating many of these same messages and stories of exploration, of culture, of ancestry, of where we come from, exploring that through the art. And we put it into the music. And so at this venue, at this show, like the energy, the way it moved through all of us was so powerful. And so I've seen music continue to be a vehicle for transformation. May 14th, I release this collection, this project that I'm incredibly excited to share with the world, that will use hip hop and use the music video that we've created in partnership with these different elements of releasing a fashion collection, a song, a public art installation, has all these different elements that go all towards furthering the conversation around land back, around the return of lands to indigenous people as a serious political alternative reality to what it is that we are experiencing right now. And so the music is continuing to be woven into the work that I do in community to uplift these stories. And for me, it's like, it's my passion, it's my purpose here on this land. And I think young people are shaping these conversations. Young people are pushing social change in such a powerful, significant way. We stand on the shoulders of many great leaders and movement leaders and movements that have come before us. And if you look at what happened with the worldwide upheaval to dismantle and address and call out white supremacy in our culture, to defend Black life, you know, how people took to the streets and ignited these conversations around police abolition, around defunding and abolishing the police. Like that was a conversation that was fueled by the fire and the anger and the love of, you know, Black organizers and young people who have continued to call for a transformation of the world that we see around us. I think young people are at the forefront of imagining and building a new future. And that is important when it comes to any issue that we're addressing, whether it's the migration of our relatives, of our peoples, whether it's the climate crisis that we face, whether it's racial inequality. You know, these different crises are calling on us to reimagine and rebuild the world. And I think part of that has to do with the stories that we tell and the narratives that we uplift. And as an artist, that's part of my work, you know, to help tell new stories and uplift new narratives. And young people all around us are building community, are building bridges, are interacting with new people, are sharing these radical and transformative ideas that, you know, just a few years ago we may have not thought were possible. the idea of abolishing and defunding police might have not been practical to the masses just a few years ago, but now it's a conversation that's being had all over the world and being taken seriously and is being implemented and reflected in policy. Because people are demanding it, because young people are demanding it, we are shaping the world around us, not just to protect future generations, but to transform these systems that have failed us. The pandemic showed us that a lot of these government systems prioritize the protection of corporate billionaires and massive corporations over the protection of human life. And those of us that are most vulnerable are being impacted by things like natural disasters and public health emergencies. And so when we look at the future, when we look at what we are building together, we all have a part to play in that. I think young people, we will step into this space to help shape these conversations and these stories, to reflect what we know is possible, and to reflect what we know we must strive for, what we must push our elected officials to fight for. And at the end of the day, these politicians are beholden to us. If we push and we create a strong enough generational mandate for a revolution that addresses this climate crisis, that transforms our energy economy, that transforms our relationship to land, that's what the future is going to be. Every moment in history where we have confronted an obstacle that has felt impossible has been overcome because people's imaginations and our will to change has been stronger than the opposition. And we stand at a time where that is more important than ever. Whereas that obstacle must not deter us from dreaming of a more just and equitable and interconnected future, but working to establish and build and create that and bring that into reality. Your voice, your energy, your passion, your work, your fire, your intention, your connection to the world around you, to your community, is what will help facilitate and foster that reality. You have a responsibility to play a role in this, as we all do. So I encourage y'all to look within and see how it is that we can build community, to build revolution, to demand a brighter, more just, and equitable future. It's very difficult, and we'll not be able to do it alone, and that's why we do need all of us, and not just the individual actions of living more, carbon-friendly lifestyles, but of challenging these systems that fundamentally are destroying our planet and that are destroying our communities. So we stand at a crossroads, and I'm grateful and inspired to be walking alongside y'all in this work to build a new future that begins with the stories we tell. Thank you.
So this year, 2021, is a crucial year in the fight against climate change. What would be the first recommendation that you would like to give to someone who's just starting to join the movement? What would be the best advice or wisdom that you would give that you wish you would have known when you were younger?
Yeah, I don't mean to plug myself like this, but I wrote a book that I published last summer called Imaginary Borders. And for me, that book was just an opportunity to reflect, a very just raw, uncensored kind of story of how I was seeing the world at that point, looking at the climate crisis, looking at climate justice movements and how we were organizing, doing a lot of this intersectional work that I've been speaking on a little bit, but it was very helpful for me to write that, because as you said, I was like, wow, I wish someone would have been able to tell me all of this, when I was a child, when I was first learning about this work, when I had, when I just wish I had heard a voice of a young person who had been in this, in that way. So I think that book holds a good amount of, it's very small too. It's a pocket-sized book. It's 60, 70 pages. So I would recommend it for folks as an introductory to some of this work from one perspective. But what I would say in short, and just a little piece of advice is change does not come from solely from individual actions or because people in power choose to do things one way or another, change ultimately societally, a transformative change that will shape the world, comes from the way we organize and build our community. And so knowing that you don't have to jump into this by yourself or be in isolation or do this alone, like the work can be, you can have a whole community of people that are riding with you, that are out there, that are on the front lines or doing the work behind the scenes. As a young person getting into this for the first time, it can be intimidating. But ground yourself in education and learning about other social movements and like studying history of other people that have also fought for liberation and for freedom and for justice. And what those journeys can do is like inform the present day and how we will then shape our movements. So I think being grounded in a strong education, a strong political education and historical education of these movements, as well as having a strong connection to those around you, to other community members, so you don't have to feel alone and isolated.
Do you know or have any favorite K-hip-hop artist?
I have not tapped into the Korean hip-hop scene as much as I should.
Not yet. You definitely should get into it.
Send me some links. I would love to learn.
I would send you some links and some of my favorite artists. I would love to see you guys like collaborate. It'd be amazing.
Absolutely. No, I'm always looking to build with other artists, different countries, different languages, different cultures.
That's awesome.
I do know some of like the best b-boys come out of Korea though. Like some of the best breakdancers. I used to watch old competition videos and like documentaries about hip hop and some of the world championships, and I like some of the best teams were always from Korea. So I know hip hop's alive and well out there. That's dope.
Okay, that's nice. Stay tuned. I'm sending you some links.
Please.